Now, as I said, we don't know why the woman from Samaria had 6 husbands. But what is likely is that you and I might know somebody today who goes from one relationship to another looking for something. Perhaps they're looking for love. Perhaps they're looking for forgiveness or acceptance. And before we shake our heads in disapproval, let's be careful. You'll be happy to know I only have one husband, and I've been married to him for more than 30 years now. But I do have a tendency to fill my life, not with relationships, but with work. Why do I work so hard, I often ask myself. It's a good question. And sometimes people fill their lives with all sorts of things. With cars, with houses, with holidays. What are they looking for? What are we looking for? Some people fill their lives with trying to make a good impression on other people, or rugby, or football, or shopping, or drinking, or watching television, or playing games online, or going on social media, or ... You can fill in your own. We're all guilty. We all have a tendency to fill our lives with stuff. And why is that? It's because there is an emptiness inside us, a longing. And that emptiness, that longing, that sense of dissatisfaction can feel like something terrible. But in fact, it's a gift. It's a gift from God. Because you and I have been created in order to be in a relationship with the God of love. And it's only God's love that can fill the emptiness and satisfy it. The emptiness is a clear sign that shows us that something is missing from our lives. St. Augustine very famously said, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." In other words, the only thing that can fill the emptiness inside us is not a thing, but it's the person of Jesus Christ. And we see this very clearly in the story. Jesus is the 7th man in the woman's life. And as many of you know, in the Bible, the number 7 is a symbol of perfection. And so Jesus offers her and us the perfect relationship that's going to fulfill her deepest needs. And once we understand this, the rest of the story makes a lot more sense. There's a word in the Bible for the tendency of trying to fill our hearts with something else that's other than God, and that word is idolatry or idol worship. You and I worship idols whenever we let anything other than God fill our lives. That can be money, it can be food, it can be work, it can be sex, it can be success, it can be clothing, it can be politics, it can be sports. Anything can become an idol. But the trouble with idols is even though they give us pleasure at the time, they can't fill that emptiness inside us. And so this story works on 2 levels. On one level, it's the story of Jesus sitting by the well and meeting a woman who's had 5 husbands and is living with the 6th man. And in this story, the well is actually very significant. It's Jacob's well. And if we read back to the Old Testament, we realize that actually Jesus and the Samaritan woman share a common ancestor. And that common ancestor is Jacob. So they're looking back to an ancestor and their family, their great, lots of great grandfathers. And that man was Jacob. And Jacob met his future wife Rachel for the first time by the well. And very often in the Old Testament, the well is a place of engagement where people get engaged to one another to be married. And so not only Jacob meets Rachel, but also Isaac meets Rebekah at a well, Moses meets Zipporah at a well. And so on one level, this is a story of a woman who at last has come across a relationship that's going to satisfy her deepest needs when she meets Jesus, the seventh man, the perfect man, who loves her with a perfect love, who's never going to abandon her or abuse her. But on the second level, this is a story about idolatry. In verse 19, the woman gives Jesus a title. She calls him prophet. Now, we tend to think of prophets as someone who can see what's going to happen in the future. But actually, mostly in the Old Testament, prophets had a different job. Their job was to look out for idolatry and to condemn it, to point the finger and say, that's idolatry, stop it. And in the conversation that develops between the woman and Jesus, we see this. Exactly in the same way as the woman was filling her life with relationships, so the people of Samaria were filling their lives with religious practices, which ironically were keeping them away from the living God. With their religion, they were just going through motions. Their religion couldn't fill the emptiness that they had inside because it didn't lead them to a relationship with the living God. So, on the second level, the woman represents the people of Samaria. And not just the people of Samaria, but people of every country and every time, including Wales today, who try to fill the emptiness inside with religion. Because religion can also be idol worship, even Christian religion, if it doesn't help us to come to a relationship with the living God. And in fact, at the beginning of the story, we see that, this is a bit harder to explain in English than in Welsh because we don't have a single U in English. So, in Welsh you have he for a lot of people and ti for one person. Well, it's the same in Greek. And this story is written in Greek originally. And so at the beginning of the story, there's a lot of the single U, the ti, where Jesus is talking to the woman. But at verse 19 it changes. And it starts using the plural you and we. Yeah, the he and the we. And so what that tells us is that the story is going from being about one woman and her relationships to being a story about the whole nation. All of the Samaritan people and the religion which is filling their lives by keeping them away from the living God. And so this woman represents everyone who is looking for God. And if you feel inside you that longing to know more about God, to have that relationship with a living God who loves you, then this woman represents you. And she realizes she's been filling that emptiness inside her with the wrong things. And so she turns to Jesus, the living water. And the living water of Jesus fills her on the inside. And so, what does she do? She gets rid of her water jar. And this is deeply symbolic as well. She doesn't need that water jar anymore. She doesn't need to keep going back to the well to search for something to quench her thirst, because Jesus, the living water, is quenching the real thirst inside her. At last, this woman has come across someone who can fill that emptiness. And so, the question then, what about you and me? You and I have been created to live in that living relationship of love with the living God. And nothing else is going to satisfy us. Nothing. God has created that emptiness inside us. And it can only be filled with his love. But on our own, we are not capable of getting to that point. And so, without Jesus, what we tend to do is we tend to compensate. We tend to try and fill that emptiness with stuff, with relationships, with work, with money, with status, with clothes, with Facebook, and so on. None of these things are bad things. All of them are good, and some of them are essential. But none of them can fill that desire that we have. None of them can satisfy it. And when we try to make them satisfy it, that's when they turn into idols. What we need to satisfy that longing, that yearning, is Jesus. He is the living water. And he says to us, if you try to slake your thirst with these sort of things, you will be thirsty again. But whoever comes to me and drinks the water that I give them will never thirst. And the water that I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. So that's the incredible promise that Jesus gives us. And there are many people here who can testify that the promise is true. And there's nothing else that satisfies. And so some questions here for this week then. This is for you to think about on your own, or if you're part of a life group, the groups that meet during the week to discuss this. And if you're not, I'd really, really encourage you to talk to me or to Paul about how you can join one. Some are online, some are face-to-face. Here are the questions. Do you have a tendency to fill your life with stuff or activity to distract you from that emptiness inside? And if you do, what do you fill it with? So that's about us as individuals, but what about us as a church? Do we do stuff as a church which distracts us from the living God? Do we have the equivalent of those religious rituals that Jesus talked to the Samaritan woman about, which don't lead us to God but distract us from him? Number 3, have you ever had that amazing experience of being filled with living water? And if so, it would be really interesting to hear about it. You can come and tell me afterwards, or you can tell your group, and maybe one or two of you, if you want to, could share it next week I'm here. And finally, the question we should ask ourselves every single time we read the Bible: what's going to change? We call this in college the so what question. We've read the passage, now so what? What's going to change as a result of having heard this gospel passage today? Because if this is true, then we can't just go home and just carry on our lives as usual. Something's got to change so we can experience some of that living water. So what do you think you need to change in your life as a result of having heard this gospel passage today? I'm going to say goodbye to our friends from YouTube.